What do our circumstances say about God's love, care, and presence? I want you to think about how you would answer that if we were just sitting and talking. If I would say, what are your circumstances, your own circumstances? What do they tell you about God's love, God's care, and God's presence in your life? Because I think how we answer that is so key to how we understand God and how we see God and how we respond to God and how we figure this whole faith thing out. Because here's something that, there's a word that pops up. In fact, it's become not necessarily a religious word. It's just a word when people are feeling like life's going really good. It's this word here, right? And again, you don't have to be religious anymore to use that. It used to be sort of the idea that God has blessed me now. It's just I'm blessed, right? And kind of everything's going really good and I'm blessed. There's this sense of gratitude, which is a good sense. But there's sort of this idea that we're blessed, and when we're blessed, things are great, right? And of course, there's the flip side, which is the one we don't want, right? When things aren't going so good, we feel, cursed. And this sounds maybe, if you've read enough of your Bible, this sounds kind of Old Testament. It kind of seems to be a picture. And those are terms that were to a specific group of people in a very specific situation. But sometimes we grab them and put them into our situations, right? This idea of being blessed or cursed. But here's another question I want us to ponder before we get into today's topic. What if our circumstances aren't a good gauge of what God thinks about us? What if they aren't? Even though we kind of think they are, right? Because when things are going good, we're blessed, and when they're not, we're like, why God, where are you at? What's going on? Why aren't you doing something right? Did I do something wrong? Did I make you mad? We go through all these sorts of feelings. But what if our circumstances aren't a good gauge of what God thinks about us? What if believing they are can lead us to believe stuff that isn't necessarily true? Because that's what we're going to talk about today. How sometimes we think certain things and how it isn't necessarily true when we buy all of that. Before we get there, I want to invite you to bow your heads and let's pray one more time together, right? Lord, today I simply want to pray for whoever might be listening, whether we're in this space or someplace outside of this building. Someone who has wondered where you're at because in their circumstances, they don't see you there. And I pray today you can take this story from so many years ago that should not have made it to our day. Matthew should have left out what he said about Jesus. But because he included it, I think it tells us something important. And I pray today that importance would hit somebody right where they need it today. That you would give them hope in spite of their circumstances, in spite of their situation. That you would let them know that you love them, that you care about them, and that our circumstances aren't always the best indicators of that. And if you can do that for someone here in this space today, this will have been time well spent. In your name, amen. Here's a true, and this is true whether you're a religious person or not, right? Whether you're kind of, sort of don't buy this whole Christianity thing, or whether you're kind of on that path. Maybe you're here today because she's kind of cute, and so this is where she comes, and you're here, and you're not really interested. But here's the truth that's true for us just as people, that it's easy to be grateful when things are going well, right? When things are up and to the right? Easy to be grateful, right? In fact, we also kind of use that. I'm blessed. I'm things are going great. Everything's falling away. I can't explain it. It's just going really, really good. And there's something that's really easy about that. But it's not so easy when things aren't, right? When things are down and to the right. And what do we do with those feelings? How do we understand those feelings? Because here's what happens, at least for those of us that are religious. We're tempted to jump to conclusions about God based on our circumstances, right? When things are going up and to the right, things are well, God is good, right? All the time, God's good. When they're going down, we may say that, but it's hard for us to get our minds around it, right? But we're tempted to jump to those conclusions about God based on our circumstances or what we see other people go through, right? Because sometimes we see what other people are going through. Wow, what's going on, right? Why is that happening? Why isn't something changing? Is God mad at them? Is God trying to teach them something? That's kind of how we people like in spaces like this talk, right? But what if that's not true? In fact, what if this whole idea that we have somehow brought over from a very specific group of people in a very specific situation, what we call the Old Testament part of the Bible, about blessing and cursing, right? This idea that, you're rewarded for all the good stuff you do, you're punished for the bad. What if that's not really true. Because I want to read to you something that Jesus said that was mind-blowing to the people who heard it when he first said it. And I think it's still even a little mind-blowing for us. Jesus, who would tell his closest followers, listen, if you've seen me, you've seen him, right? If you want to know what God's like, look at me was Jesus' basic point. Listen to the things I say, see the things I do, see how I treat people. And here's what Jesus said at one moment. In fact, he said it just after he's in this big sermon he's preaching, this real famous sermon, his coming out party sermon that goes all these different topics. Just after saying, listen, we've all heard this, right? We ought to, love the people that are good to us and hate our enemies, right? But he says, no, that's not how it should work. And he says these words that day. He said, listen, talking about God, for he causes, I love this, his son, not just the son, God causes his son to rise on evil people and on good people. No difference. That God makes the sun shine on both of them. And he sends rain to those who do right, the righteous, and to those who do wrong, the unrighteous. That God shows up for everybody. Not just those of us that are good or think that we're good, or for those of us that know we aren't good. Everybody gets the exact same stuff because Jesus would say, this is how God is like. It's not like you've been taught, not how we've heard. Because here's the reality. We think rewards for being good, right? In fact, we think that for a couple of reasons. One is because that's kind of how life works, right? In general, at least that's how we hope it works. Because we went to school, and if you did well, you got an A, right? Or a little star, right? And something that, kind of little thing. Everything's good. There's rewards for being good, and you go to work, and normally this idea you got to kind of work your way up, and you get rewarded for higher positions for the work you've done normally, I say, right? Because we all know there's exceptions, and those are the ones that really frustrate us because we think you ought to get rewarded for doing good. And we also think, there's penalty for being not good. And again, we learn that. If you grow up in a family that cares about you, you're going to have this idea that when you don't do what you're supposed to do, there's going to be some penalties, right? And so for our own life experience teaches this idea about, rewards for being good, penalties for being not good. But what if things aren't as simple as blessed or cursed? What if they're not quite that simple? In fact, what if good stuff doesn't happen because we're good? Because it's kind of what Jesus said, isn't it? In fact, let me throw out one more what if. What if we're not blessed because we're good, but because he is? Because sometimes we can forget that, right? Sometimes we can think, no, it's because I was really good. I did, I helped that elderly neighbor. I helped her, bring her groceries in. I was really good. That's why I got this promotion, because I've been really good. So today we're going to look at another story about a person that Jesus let down. Remember a couple of weeks ago we looked at Lazarus and his sisters? If you weren't here, you ought to go back and watch it online. It's this crushing story of when Jesus let not only those three people down, but also his disciples down. Seemed like he had misled them. It's this crazy story. It's one of those ones that you wonder, how did this get in the Bible? And I think the reason it gets in the Bible is because it was true. It happened. But it's one of those things that if you were trying to write to make Jesus look like this wonderful guy, it's a story you would have skipped over, right? Today we have another one of those stories, and it's about a guy called John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist, right? A little background on John. He's related to Jesus. He was a cousin of Jesus. And he was a special kid from birth. His parents, his mom hadn't been able to have kids. Her and her husband had gotten really old, and then God shows up and says, surprise, you're going to have a baby. And the dad's like, what? That can't be true. And so the dad was a priest, and he loses his voice. You got to go back and read it. This is a great story that God shows up and says, hey, I'm going to give you a baby, but this is going to be a special baby. He's going to be set apart. He's going to do he's going to do such an important role for this earth's history, because he's going to pave the way. He's going to set everything up for Jesus when he shows up. In fact, when John gets older and begins his, what they call his ministry, he takes the spot of sort of an Old Testament prophet. He's bold, he's brash, he's blunt, right? There are no gray areas for John. Everything's right or wrong, and he's straight. He's direct at people. He's calling, these devoutly religious people everyone looks up to, like, you snakes and vipers, right? Who told you to come out here, right, to seek some forgiveness from God? He's telling people to get baptized. First known thing in history of people getting baptized for for the repentance of sins, right? This cleansing thing. And so John is out by the Jordan River. He's baptizing people. Literally, we're told, I'm sure it's hyperbole. It's one of those things in the Bible that you say, okay, it couldn't have been 100% true, but it's setting the stage when he says everybody in Jerusalem, everybody in all of Judea came out to see him, which is like a big top thing, right? But the idea that John became really, really popular. And he became popular because of his boldness, of his bluntness. And because of the role he was playing. His job was to set the stage. In fact, he would say later, listen, when he sees Jesus, and as popular as John was, he would say, hey, this isn't about me, it's about him now. And he's got to take the next step. I'm just setting the stage for him. He's going to take it on from here going forward. In fact, Jesus would say about John the following words. I tell you the truth, John the Baptist is greater than any other person ever born, literally any other person born to a woman. Pretty crazy, right? I mean, you go down through your list, and the group he would have been talking today would have thought, well, hey, what about David, right? What about Moses, right? Jesus is like, nope. John was the GOAT, right? The greatest who ever lived. I mean, that's Jesus language, right? This guy is like the greatest who's ever been born, which you kind of may be thinking, well, I thought Jesus was born of a woman, right? But Jesus is like, no, John's it, right? This is what Jesus thought about John, which is important, and I think it's why Jesus says it, because of all the other stuff that gets recorded about this story. So here's the stage. While John's doing his preaching, there's a guy on the scene by the name of Herod. Herod the Great. He's king over this region. Rome let people be kings over different regions. He's over this region. He was called the Great not because he was a good guy. In fact, he was a terrible guy. But he was called great because he built so much stuff. He he turned these old fortresses into beautiful palaces. He was just this guy who was always building, and turning these beautiful places, right? But he was really horrific. In fact, if you're familiar at all with the Bible story of Jesus, you remember the story that the wise men come from this faraway place and they're looking for Jesus. They come and see Herod the Great, and Herod is so fearful of the potential of this Messiah, this somebody of the Jews that they're talking about, going to be growing up, that he goes to the place where he hears they're from, or that they were looking for, and literally kills all the little baby boys, like 2 years and younger. So he just slaughters all these people because he's so afraid that some baby is a threat to him. Kind of picture of him. But towards the end of his life, and it's either right before he dies or after he dies, he divides his kingdom, his thing that he has controlled among three of his children, three of his sons. And the sons are Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Herod Philip. And you've caught something, they're all named Herod, which is where it becomes confusing for us when we read our Bibles, because we see the word Herod, but we don't have the other name to go with it, and sometimes it gets a little confusing, right? But these are his three sons. He divides these different parts up. And the two we're going to talk about today that are directly related to John are these two, Antipas and Philip. Now, Antipas and Philip have these two regions that are kind of close to the area. Antipas is over Judea and kind of a swath there. He's kind of over the parts in the Bible that we read, record in the New Testament, especially in the stories about Jesus' life, the Gospels. He becomes the Herod that is most often talked about. They also have, they got a bunch of siblings, right? They got a half-sister who has a daughter, and to keep in family tradition, she names her daughter Herodias. So we got Herodias, and we got her two uncles. So somewhere along the line, Herodias and her uncle Philip get married. So we got uncle, husband, Philip. They have a daughter who will play a part in John's story later, called Salome. She comes along later. But at some point, Philip, is going about his royal business. He goes to Rome on an extended trip. While he's gone, Herodias and Antipas, they have a little fling. And it becomes kind of a bigger thing. They decide they're in love. And so Herodias divorces uncle, husband Philip, and marries uncle, husband Antipas. Which we're all like, ooh, right? I mean, this is like crazy, right? How's this stuff happening? And so that sets the scene for all the stuff that comes now with John, because when John hears this, because Antipas is over the region where John is doing all this preaching, he goes, not in my house, we're not doing that, right? We're not doing that here, folks. And so he calls out the king, and the new queen and says, this is not right. You have gone, not just the whole marrying your niece, which is creepy enough, but the idea that you've married your brother's wife when your brother's still alive, right? It was kind of against the Torah. It was against the law that they had there. And it was just creepy, right? And society-wise, John's like, I know that, whatever the rulers do, other people are going to pick up on. We don't need this kind of foolishness going on here. This is wrong. He begins to publicly call him out. Speaking truth to power, I think is how we put it today, right? Which doesn't sit so well with Herodias. Now, Herod, as you read enough of the story, he kind of has this respect for John. He kind of likes to listen to him. He doesn't really understand him, but he's kind of like, he likes listening to him because it's maybe some entertainment, or maybe it just kind of sparks some ideas as he gets to thinking. But he also was afraid that John has become so popular that if he does something to John, people could rise up and get mad at him. But his new wife is not happy. In fact, here's how Mark, via Peter, records it. He says, Herod himself had ordered his soldiers to arrest John and put him in prison because of his wife, Herodias. The reason he arrested him is because of his wife. Now, if you're married, you completely understand this. If you're not, you're like, why is that? It is a thing, right? But it's like, she's just after me. You got to do something about this guy. How dare he? How can he call about, he's all right, I'll take care of it. We arrest him, throw him in prison. And in fact, Mark will tell us that, oh, by the way, she'd been the wife of Philip, Herod's brother, but then Herod had married her, right? And John had been telling Herod, it's not lawful for you to be married to have your brother's wife, right? This is the whole thing that gets him in so much trouble. And this is when the story goes in an unexpected direction. And it gets frustratingly confusing or really encouraging, depending on how you read it, how you think about it. And I think that's important because it really is one of those moments that a long old story of a real event crosses paths with where we find ourselves sometimes. Because sometimes we're confused by what God's doing, right? And sometimes we're encouraged by what God's doing. And I'm hoping when we end today, you'll be encouraged by this very seemingly confusing story. So there's the scene. John's been shooting off his mouth, calling Herod out in public. And finally, he gets arrested. He gets thrown in prison. And we're going to pick up Matthew as he was there, as he tells the story, his part of the story. He says that when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, when he'd been arrested, he went. And what do you think he went to do? Did he go to Herod and say, you got to be nice to my cousin. This is not a good idea. You need to get him out. Does he go down to visit him? Maybe send some of his closest followers down to tell John, hey, we know this is going on. We're praying for you. We brought some, fish and some loaves, something to have some food while you're here. That's not what Matthew says. In fact, this is one of those moments that you have to wonder, why did Matthew write this? Because he says that when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he went back. He withdrew to Galilee. Which I think normally when we read this, we go, all right, he just kind of went back to wherever he was coming from. But that's not the whole story, and I'm going to show you in just a minute why that isn't. But he says, listen, he left Nazareth and he went to live in Capernaum, a town near Lake Galilee by the sea. So I'm going to try to recreate this so we have a little better understanding. I'll put a map up here. I don't know how well you can see it, but you can kind of see 4 dots there. You got Jerusalem, right? The hub of everything in Israel. Nazareth is up there, top left, or kind of middle of the screen, right? That's where Jesus and his guys are at when they get the news that John has been arrested, right? So John gets arrested and he goes to this place called Machaerus. Machaerus is this desert outpost. They got a prison there, and you can imagine it'd be bad enough to be in prison because it's literally just like a hole in the ground in the cell and you're thrown in, but it's hot, it's the desert, right? And it probably smells bad because there's not great ventilation. And oh, by the way, you don't get fed food. You have to have people bring you food. It's not the job, the guard's job to feed you. So, John had lots of disciples that were bringing him food, bringing him news, right? Keeping him going. But John goes down there. Jesus is up in Nazareth. He could have come down to Machaerus, right? But instead, Jesus goes to Capernaum. Jesus goes farther away from John. In fact, I want you to get a picture. John is down in this dry, hot desert, in this lonely cell, in this prison, out in the middle of the desert, right? It's a place that Herod will actually pump a bunch of money into and change it into this palace, this sort of palace out on this hill. It was on the easternmost part of his territory. Had originally started as a lookout to watch and keep signs if anybody's attacking, right? But he turns it into a palace. But it's great for where he's living, not so great where John's living. And here's I don't have a picture of what John would have seen because it would have just been a dark picture because it was in a cell, right? But here's the picture of what Jesus would have saw when he and the boys went to Capernaum right by the lake. So I'm imagining that as this all happens, John's kind of wondering what's going on, right? And he hears some stories about where Jesus has, moved his ministry to. They kind of take up Capernaum as their home base. And so, 6 months go by. No Jesus. He doesn't show up. None of his disciples show up to talk to John, see how he's doing, encourage him. A year goes by. A year and a half goes by. And he never hears from Jesus. This is John. John, the guy who Jesus would say is the GOAT, is the greatest of all time, that his role was so pivotal in what Jesus could do. Jesus couldn't have done what he did without John. This is the guy that's been so vital. He's not only family, as important as that would have been, but he's also, forever tied to Jesus' story. And so after this year and a half, John the Baptizer does what we would have done. Right? Because again, he's got guys coming and going, and they're telling him stories about what Jesus is doing, but no message from Jesus, no interest from any of his disciples. And he feels what we would feel. Feels abandoned, alone, and forgotten. Because he's out in the middle of the stinking desert, and he knows that Jesus is down by the lake. And he begins to wonder if he had Jesus all wrong. And isn't it true that sometimes we get to those places where, the arrow had been going up to the right, now it's going down, right? And we begin to wonder, is all the stuff we believe true, right? We begin to have those doubts, those questions that sink in. Back to the story. John the Baptist was in prison, but he heard about what Christ was doing, right? So he's got these stories coming on. So after a year and a half, he sends some of his own followers, his disciples, to Jesus, because John had a big following. In fact, when he said, hey, Jesus is the next step, right? Here's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. You got to go follow him. Some of them had left, but he still got a bunch of followers, a bunch of devoted people to him. And he tells them, I need you to do something special for me. I need you to go find Jesus up there by the lake. I need you to ask him a question. And here's that question that they came and asked Jesus. Jesus, are you the one who is to come? Are you the expected one? Are you the Messiah? Or should we look for, should we expect someone else? John sent us to ask, but honestly, Jesus, we have the exact same question. Because we've seen what John's going through and we kind of see where you're living right now. And are you it? Are you the one are you the one that he spent his whole kind of professional career, his ministry, setting the stage for, believing that he was doing something to set the stage for you, but are you the one? To which Jesus responds in kind of an interesting way. Because typically if we thought about it, we think, well, hey, Jesus would, give some soothing words back to him, tell John, we haven't forgotten him, right? Hang in there. You've been really important. But that isn't what Jesus says to these guys to take back to John. In fact, here's what he says. He says, guys, go and report to John what you hear and what you see. Just look around. Don't look at the beach too much, but just look around at the people, right? Look around at the ministry that's going on. Look around at the stories you're hearing and the things that you're seeing that we're doing here. Tell them that the blind can see, the crippled, the lame can walk, and people with skin disease, the lepers are healed, they're cleansed. Tell them all this incredible stuff is going on. Tell them the deaf can hear, the dead are raised to life. Tell them the good news. The gospel is preached to the poor. In other words, tell him about all the things I'm doing for everyone else. Tell him how good stuff is going for everybody else. which seems so harsh, but then Jesus says maybe the most important, if not at least one of the most important things he ever said, especially in this kind of context. Where we got this guy who has been so important, so valuable, right? Such a recognized name who's now in this prison, and he's beginning to doubt because Jesus hadn't come see him. He doesn't feel close to God. In fact, he feels like we do sometimes, that, as Jesus withdrew, sometimes we feel like God has gotten farther and farther away. But here's the thing that Jesus said that is so deep and wide and broad that sometimes it's a little hard to get our minds around. But he looks at the guys after telling them, hey, go tell them all the stuff you're seeing and hearing, all the great stuff happening for everybody else. Those who do not stumble in their faith, those who are not offended because of me, are blessed. See, Jesus knows that there are times we won't understand what he's doing or not doing. And that's important. Because sometimes we think, well, no, he's got to know, right? He has to know all this stuff. But there are times that we don't understand. So to put it another way, he's saying, listen, blessed is the one who doesn't interpret my inaction as apathy. Blessed is the one who, when I don't do the things they expect, don't come through, don't change circumstances, still trusts me and believes in me and follows me in spite of me. I mean, Jesus is owning this moment, isn't he? He's saying, go back and tell John this stuff, and I know it's going to be hard for him. And I let him know that I don't want him to stumble because of what he perceives about me, though I know he might. See, what if Jesus understands our confusion and our doubts? What if more than understand them, what if Jesus anticipated them? Because as you read the story, you have to say, why did Matthew tell us those details, right? Why did he tell us, why did he just tell us John was sent to prison, right? As opposed to telling us that when that happened, Jesus intentionally withdrew farther away, moved away and moved to a whole different kind of section, and then left him there without anything. And I think the answer, at least as I understand it, is two reasons. One is it was true, it happened. So Matthew kind of felt compelled to tell the truth, right? And secondly, I think it's because when he writes this, because this is written down, quite a bit later, that it's, recorded and passed around. I think at that point, Matthew has begun to understand a whole lot more, and he begins to understand this idea of the doubts and questions, because after this point, when he's writing this down and sending it out, he has gone through his own moments of doubt and questions. When Jesus is killed, right? And when he's crucified, and when they're sitting over that whole Sabbath, that Saturday, when they sat there and wondered, what do we do now? And what does this mean? And we thought we'd given everything to this, so we thought he was the one, and it doesn't look like he's the one. And what if our own doubts and confusions are still anticipated by Jesus? I mean, Jesus' message to the guys that were John's followers is simply this: John was one of my favorites, but I'm not going to rescue him. It gets worse. No matter how much faith he had, no matter how obedient he was. And that can sound harsh, right? So let me ask you some deep theological questions that maybe can help all of us. Did Jesus care about John? What do you think? Yes? No? Yes? Did Jesus love John? That's important to know, isn't it? Because even in those moments when it doesn't seem like he cares or loves because of the circumstances, maybe those circumstances aren't the best gauge of all that. Because what if that's true for us too? In this series, we've looked at a couple of the the most uncomfortable stories from Jesus' life, where Jesus let two of his favorite people suffer and die. Right? Lazarus and these sisters who were really, really close to Jesus. I mean, when the sisters send the news to Jesus, remember, Jesus, the one you love is sick, right? They didn't even say Lazarus, the one you love, to remind him how this connection was so close. And yet he doesn't show up. He doesn't show up before he dies. And now John is down in this prison. And ultimately he will die. Because Herodias isn't still done with John. She'll work the whole story, and she'll get her daughter, which is now Herod's stepdaughter, and also like grandniece or something like that. I mean, it's just a crazy thing, right? She'll come and do this kind of dance enough that he goes, wow, that was really good. That was so good. You ask, whatever you want, I'm going to give to you, right? Up to half my kingdom. I don't know about you, that'd have to be a really good dance for me to get half away my stuff, right? And again, this isn't like just some other woman. This is your niece wife's daughter, which tells you how just messed all this was. But Jesus lets two of his favorite people suffer and die, which is a reminder that there aren't always good answers to our questions. Right? So let me get us thinking just as we wrap this up today. What if doubt and questions are part of following Jesus? Would be okay with that? Because I know sometimes when you've come to a place like this and heard from people like me who just tell you, your problem is you don't have enough faith. You just need to pray more, right? You need to trust more, right? You need to believe more. That's the issue. And those are easy things to say because, it's not me that's having to go through it, right? But what if doubt and questions really are part of following Jesus? Because here's something I'm convinced about. That doubt is baked into the story of faith. You can go back and read any part of the Bible you want. You will discover there was doubts, there were questions, and they're all part of the story of faith that's coming through in those stories. See, the truth is, we're not the first and won't be the last people to struggle to make sense out of the randomness of life. But here's the thing about the randomness of life. That doesn't mean that God has lost control or that God doesn't love us and isn't still at work in our life. So let me finish this today by saying what sounds like what you have heard in a place like this before, but I want to say it in a different way. But when I say that, I want to add something to it. We ought to trust God and follow Jesus in spite of our doubts and questions. And maybe a better way to put it is with our doubts and questions, right? Because I know it's easy to think right now, well, Mike, you don't know my story, and I probably don't. And if I heard your story, I probably would tell you I don't have an answer for you. But my inability to answer it shouldn't be cause for us to lose faith. Because nobody can get every question they have answered. There's no way to prove most things, right? I mean, we will be inundated over these next, sadly, 3 months with people trying to prove stuff to us, right? They'll say the opposite things. And you're like, how do I figure this all out? Do I go? And then you have to figure out which fact-checking source is going to be the one that you rely most on, right? And you go through all this kind of life is filled with doubts and questions. And those doubts and questions typically come up in those moments when our circumstances are not going up and to the right, but are going down and to the right, right? So let me ask it one more time. What do our circumstances say about God's love, care, and presence? What if it's less than we think? Something to think about today.